Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Dibble. I am one of the co-coordinators of the industry team for the Ivy Film Festival, and I'm here with Valerie Jarrett as part of the Ivy Film Festival's digital speaker series. Valerie Jarrett is a New York Times bestselling author of Finding My Voice, a businesswoman, and a politician. She was senior advisor to President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017. She oversaw the Offices of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, in addition to chairing the White House Council on Women and Girls. She has a BA from Stanford and a JD from University of Michigan. She is currently chairman of the board of When We All Vote, co-chair of the United States of Women, and a senior advisor to the Obama Foundation. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's truly a pleasure, Valerie.
Well, Jessica, it's always a pleasure to see you, and I'm delighted to join you and everyone else who's trying to make the best of a very tough situation.
Most definitely. So Valerie, I know you want to use this time to promote When We All Vote. When We All Vote is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is on a mission to increase participation in every election and close the race and age voting gap by changing the culture around voting. So tell us about how you are harnessing grassroots energy to promote your mission with When We All Vote.
So, as you know, we launched it a couple of years ago. It was spearheaded by former First Lady Michelle Obama, and her goal, as you stated, Jessica, is to try to change the culture around voting in our election. We saw that 100 million people didn't vote in the last presidential election, and though we saw a bit of an uptick during the midterm elections, young people particularly, they went from voting at about 20% to 30%. So 70% still didn't vote. And so we thought, let's meet people where they are and see how we can harness the energy that's already out there in a lot of parts of our country and get people to form voting squads, make it cool to vote again, but also talk about how important it is that we fulfill our responsibility as citizens, and that we can't shun government just because we don't like it. We have to change it. And it's we, the people, the citizens, who have the most power to do that. And there have been historically lots of grassroots organizations around the country who are focused on this issue. And I think Michelle Obama thought, well, use her platform to really highlight how important it is to vote in every election. So it isn't just about one candidate or one office, and certainly not just about who runs for president. It matters who's the mayor, who's on the city council, who's in the legislature, who are the prosecutors, who is in Congress, the check and balance that we have. In many parts of our country, judges are elected. Who are the judges that are making really important decisions about our lives? And we've seen a lot of momentum, and this current climate poses a lot of challenges, but also a lot of creativity. So twice in the last 3 weeks, DJ D Nice, who has his jam sessions and is spinning music for us, has dedicated a portion of his set to us, and we have been able to get volunteers to come on and get excited about getting everyone out to vote. And yes, it's more challenging now, but it's also an opportunity to be really creative and meet people where they are.
Yeah, no, I am watching those live videos by DJ Nice. And so kind of going off of that, as it is an election year, the responsibility and right to vote is more important than ever. How do you foster the engagement of high-profile people who are not in politics to use their platforms for When We All Vote?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because what's clear is that we have to reach influencers, but the influencers have to feel passionately about this issue. Otherwise, their followers won't. Their brand is authenticity, right? Mm-hmm. And so we meet them where they are, and we try to get people who are influential to tell their story about why voting is important to them. And so, for example, I used to go to the polls with my parents when I was a young child. I looked forward to it. I was so excited to be in that voting booth. And I did the same thing with my daughter. Mm-hmm. And it fostered in me this sense of anticipation and excitement. I remember the first time I voted was when I voted for Jimmy Carter, who was running for president when I was still in college. And so if we can get influencers to tell their stories and explain why voting is so important to them, talk about the issues that they care about, and it could be anything from criminal justice reform to reducing gun violence to gender equity to climate change. There are lots of issues that people who have incredible megaphones and platforms care about. And what we have to do is to connect the issues they care about with how people in government affect those issues and make that connection so that people see that their vote really does matter. And that's how we've gotten influencers to come share their stories. And when the people who look up to them see that authenticity and hear those stories, that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, going off of that, I'm thinking about my own first time voting. It was more like a family affair. It was really a wonderful time. But as the world faces a pandemic, the United States in particular is facing a threat to civic engagement due to this virus and the opportunity to go in person to vote. How is When We All Vote working to ensure every American's right to vote is protected? In addition, what actions can still be taken to encourage voter turnout?
Well, there's a lot more we should be doing. And there are two issues going on here. So there have been historically efforts in our country to suppress the vote. And we've seen states pass laws that make it more difficult to vote. We've seen practices that were applied to try to repress the vote. But what When We All Vote is focusing on is, well, let's not disenfranchise ourselves. But given this global pandemic, we shouldn't have to choose between keeping ourselves safe and exercising this really important right to vote. And we saw a couple of weeks ago in the Wisconsin primaries, those lines of people who were waiting to vote, but in the middle of a pandemic. And we've already heard examples of people who were in those lines who now have tested positive for the COVID-19. So what can we do? Well, three things. And Mrs. Obama announced this a couple of weeks ago. Number one, we need to ensure that every single American can vote by mail. And Congress needs to appropriate the funds to support the Postal Service. Those postal workers are working really hard right now, but they need more resources in order to accommodate a larger influx of ballots by mail. The military has always voted by mail, and it has worked quite successfully. There are states such as Washington State, mandatory, everybody votes by mail. It can be done. And we want to begin this effort, Jessica, now, so that states have time to get their ducks in a row to accommodate this voting by mail. The second thing that's important, and this has been important long before the pandemic, is we need every state to have an expanded early vote opportunity. There are a lot of folks who can't take off work on a Tuesday, who cannot just show up and they don't have the flexibility in their schedule. Or things come up. You might get sick that day. Your child might need you to do something. You get distracted. Let's have an early vote opportunity in every state so that people have more days within which they can go and exercise that right to vote. And the reason why that's so important right now is if people can vote by mail or they can vote early, then there are going to be fewer people that actually show up on the polls on election day. And if we're still under this cloud of this pandemic, everybody will be safer. And then the final thing that we're asking for, Jessica, is to let everybody register to vote online. With technology being what it is, every state in the country should have people able to vote online, to register to vote online. That saves you a trip down to the voter registration place, and it allows people to do it right now. Everybody's sitting at home. Those who are not essential workers, go and vote online.
Yeah, those are really three interesting and crucial necessities for basically increasing voter participation. And so kind of touching on that, you mentioned how influencers have this large following because of their authenticity and really just their reach through media. Beginning of the Obama administration, when you were in the White House, and expanding greatly since, the intersection between politics and media, by which I mean media in addition to news media, has shaped and arguably transformed both fields. As someone who has perspective in both sides, how do you see this relationship affecting each field, and how has a growing influence of politics and media changed media and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a complicated piece of business right there. So just to date myself for a minute, when I was growing up, the nightly news would come on, and there were local newspapers and some national newspapers. And so once a day, in the morning you read the newspaper, and at night you listened to the nightly news. And Walter Cronkite, for example, was an iconic figure. And you knew that whatever he said to be factually true, he spent all day with his team trying to get it right, and he had one shot at it. And what he did not do, except on one occasion, was mix editorial versus the news. He was very clearly there to report the news. Now what we've seen is a blurring of the lines between news and information, editorial, and entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be back in the day that the news was a loss leader. Nobody was making any money on the news. It was just something you knew that you had to do as a public service. Now the news and certain networks has turned into a pretty lucrative business.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this pressure to make it entertaining, to draw viewers and draw advertisers versus simply just the facts. And then you add to that social media and the fact that you can get news from so many different sources, and the news that you receive is now on demand, in that you decide what news you want to take in, as opposed to Walter Cronkite being your only option. Now you've got a whole range of choices. And what we find is, of course, that sometimes people who watch Fox don't watch MSNBC, people who read one set of newspapers don't read another. It's getting easier and easier to get into our cocoon and only listen to what we want to hear and not get comfortable being uncomfortable. And also, you, the consumer, has to decide what's fact, what's editorial, and what's entertainment. Mm-hmm. And you're not in a position to always do that, right? Mm-hmm. And you add to that the fact that our society, our democracy, really relies on an independent, free media. Mm-hmm. It is an important check and balance of government. It's an important check and balance of the public, of the private sector. So both the private and the public sector are checked by the media. And so it has to be valued and it has to be supported, but it also has to be accurate. And that's the challenge right now. And we're in the middle of this incredible technological revolution. I mean, social media has exploded just in the course of your very short lifetime. And so what do we do to try to find those sources of just factually accurate information? How do we appreciate that editorial has a place, mm-hmm. but not in the news? Right. And that entertainment has the potential to erode that important check and balance. And so when we were in the White House, we were very careful to make sure that whatever we said to the media was accurate as possible. Now, do we always get it perfectly right? No, of course not, because you're just going on the best information that you have at the moment. Mm-hmm. But the reason why it's so important is that you use the media to communicate with your constituents. That's the vehicle through which you have a broad reach. Now, we also learned over the course of our administration that with your own social media, you have a way of communicating directly, and we've seen how that has happened since we've left the administration. But the purpose of the media is a very valuable tool with which to communicate, and it should be handled responsibly and accurately as best you can, because people are relying on that information.
Exactly. I thought an interesting point you made was that media used to be more of a public service and now it's more lucrative, which I think was a very interesting point. And kind of going off of that, in your administration, you learned that social media is a way to really reach constituents more directly. Yeah. And so I want to ask you, what do you think it was about your administration, the Obama administration, that galvanized so many previously apolitical figures with large platforms such as actors, directors, and athletes to kind of get involved with political causes and promote civic engagement in particular?
Well, I think, look, President Obama tried to reach people where they are. Right. And he tried to relate to people who had not traditionally been involved in politics, to get them to understand that it isn't just about politics, it's about service, mm-hmm. it's about communicating, and it's about feeling as though we're all in this together. And his entire campaign was really, it was about hope and it was about change, but it was about, yes, we can. It was not, I can. It's not like I'm going to go over there and do something by myself. That wasn't what he was saying. Mm-hmm. He was saying, we as a nation are stronger when we were working together. We're not just the red states and the blue states, we're the United States. And I think that broad appeal, that inclusive outreach resonated with a lot of Americans, and not just Democrats, but independents and Republicans, and certainly a lot of people who had shunned politics, if you would, right. but appreciated service. Mm-hmm. And he really came at it with, let's talk about the issues that you care about. And so part of being, I think, an effective leader is listening. Mm-hmm. And so you can't just ask somebody, go out and talk about criminal justice reform if the person's passion is climate. And so that's the other thing, is we ask people to talk about the things that they cared about. And we had a lot of influencers who were part of the campaign back in 2007 and 2008. And they did their own stump speeches, and they went out and they talked about, look, this is what I care about. It might have been healthcare, it might have been any issue. And so in a sense, they looked to President Obama to see where he stood on those issues, and then they could speak authentically and with a sense of confidence about where he stood on those issues because he was so clear about his policies. And so you have to reach people where they are. You have to allow them to talk about issues that they care about. You have to listen to them and make sure that they feel as though they're included. And all of that work that we laid the seed for in the campaign, Jessica, is what we carried into the White House. And when I oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs, our purpose was to make sure that the American people and the state and local elected officials could weigh in on the policies before we adopted them. So we would know what the impact was going to be on the stakeholders. And we did that without regards to politics. We were inclusive. Everybody was welcome. Not everybody chose to come, but everybody was welcome. And we tried to make sure that we cast a broad net in terms of the input so that President Obama made informed decisions. And he used to always relish talking to people who disagreed with him. Mm-hmm. And not that he would always change his mind, but just so that he could sharpen the intellect and the rigor with which he addressed a given issue. There's no point just talking to people who agree with you. You want to hear the other side, and you also want to hear from the people who are going to be most directly impacted by your decisions.
Exactly. So kind of going off of that, part of how we view our platform at the Ivy Film Festival with the student films and screenplays we showcase is the curation of a vision of Hollywood for the next generation. So you are involved in movements like Time's Up, which brings together women from a broad range of industries who are working to eradicate gender-based discrimination in all forms. The rise of women in the industry in our own organization, our leadership team is 85% female and our staff is 75% female, is part of what has encouraged and inspired our vision for the future. Since you began working with Time's Up, how have you seen the entertainment industry and beyond change to start to incorporate or validate more women? And even in your work as chairing the Women on Girls Council at the White House, how did that kind of incorporate and validate more women as well?
Yeah, so I start with the basic principle that diversity and inclusion are a strength. Mm-hmm. And that what we have to look at are what are the structural and cultural impediments that keep women from thriving in society. And it's everything from the implicit biases that we see in the toys and entertainment and movies that our children have at a very young age, where we're sending them these implicit messages about what women should and should not do, mm-hmm. To how they're treated in the workplace. And so both at the United States of Women and Time's Up, we're focusing on what do we do to create a healthy environment where every young girl could grow up and thrive. Mm-hmm. And there are some basic practices in the workplace in particular, and the entertainment industry has drilled down on this, that we should be focusing on. And I should pause to say that a lot of the work that Time's Up is doing now came out of the Me Too movement and the brave survivors who came forward with enormous personal risk and attack to tell their stories. And there is safety in numbers, and I think what we've seen over the last several years is this groundswell of support for the initial women who came forward, but in every company in this country, conversations that are happening around the boardroom are what are we going to do to make sure that our culture is one that supports those working families and where sexual harassment and discrimination are not possible. Not just because it's the right thing to do, Jess, but because there's a business imperative for it now. And we've seen examples over the last few years of what happens when you have leaders within these companies mm-hmm. who do not appreciate and respect women and who have been allowed for too long to get away with that. The consequences can be devastating, but those consequences still pale in comparison to what the survivors have gone through. So we still have a lot of hard work left to do. And I think what we began to appreciate in the White House during those 8 years is that we were seeing this paradigm shift, and that companies were beginning to say, well, do we pay our workers equally, men and women? Do we have workplace flexibility, recognizing people have responsibilities outside of the workplace to their families? Do we have paid leave? Do we have paid sick days? We're seeing now in this pandemic Many of our workers, particularly the essential workers, often don't have paid leave,
Right.
paid sick days. If they're sick, they have to choose between going to work, which puts us all at peril, or taking care of their families. That's unconscionable in our country. We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a national paid leave policy.
Right.
Every culture and every company should have practices to ensure that their workers are safe. And that's everything from our OSHA requirements to sexual harassment. And what I'm seeing in the conversations and the boards where I serve and my colleagues with whom I speak who are running businesses is that business community now is beginning to recognize it's a business imperative. But we have a long way to go. Just because it's recognized at the top,
Right.
studies are showing it doesn't necessarily trickle down. McKinsey and Wall Street Journal did a study several months ago that showed that even though like 70% of CEOs get this,
Right.
that at the lowest level of the corporate ladder, men are still outperforming women 2-to-1. So we have to make sure that it trickles down. And we have to make sure that when people are coming out of college, they appreciate this, which is part of why we launched It's On Us when we were in the White House to end sexual assault on college campuses. 1 in 5 women are assaulted while in college. And the practices that begin, or I shouldn't say begin, because some of it begins in high school, but that happen in college, continue into the workplace unless we as a society decide we're going to change it. And the culture change is the one that is most sustainable.
As you mentioned, it's a trickle down process. And I'm kind of curious, which areas do you think or industries have made the greatest strides, and why do you think that is so far?
Well, I think the stride is in looking at diversity as a strength as opposed to a nice to do. And I do think I go to a lot of conferences where they're profiling the best places to work.
Right.
And I think CEOs now pride themselves on that competitive advantage. As we compete in a global marketplace, our best asset is our human capital. Everybody wants the smartest, the brightest, most thoughtful perspectives, and also the most diverse perspectives. Because again, if a CEO is only talking to a bunch of people who look and sound the way, let's say, he does, then how are you going to deliver goods and services to a diverse marketplace? And so I think the light bulb has gone off, and more folks are recognizing at the top, oh, this is a business imperative. And the reason why it's so important that it's a business imperative is that in a time like this when the economy is shrinking and everybody's challenged because of this pandemic, the tendency will be to cut the nice to do things, right? You're not going to cut a business imperative. And so if you have a strong recruitment apparatus to go out and try to reach people so that you are pulling from a diverse pool in order to do your hiring, you're not going to cut that if you think that's important.
Right.
You will cut it if you think it's a nice to do. And I think that has been a big shift over the last 10 years.
I think your leadership in movements like Time's Up really show how formidable you are in trying to break down these barriers.
It takes a team. It takes a lot of people, brave people speaking up. And we're there to help them with the legal resources they need in the event that they are faced with this horrible, horrible situation of being harassed. But they also have to come forward. And that means the rest of us, and I mean all of us, not just women and men who haven't survived sexual harassment or assault, we have to be the allies.
Most definitely. I kind of want to shift back to understanding how the public has seemed to turn to more stabilizing forces in this time's crisis. We need to look towards someone or towards something to kind of gain some grounding during this crisis. And especially in the absence of clear messaging from our leadership, you and your wisdom, especially your insight, your rationalism, and your thoughtfulness are one such stabilizing figure that people look to. I want to know who are the people and forces, whether that's certain public entities, foundation, media, or art, that who have you found to be particularly meaningful during this turbulent time?
Oh, well, I'll answer it in 2 different ways. So because I'm now in New York, I have been really impressed with how Governor Cuomo has handled this pandemic. He has daily news conferences. He starts with the facts because we all want to know, well, how many people are hospitalized? How many people have died? How many people have been diagnosed? What are the challenges? Right out my window, the USNS Comfort was docked for a few weeks because we thought we were going to really need additional beds available to treat patients. And fortunately, we didn't. But what he did was he prepared for the worst and hoped for the best. And I think he's been able to, in a very clear and concise way, communicate to the residents of New York State what exactly is going on the best he knows it. And when the facts change and new information comes in, he says, well, this is what we now know. And the other thing that he's done that's really important, Jessica, I think for leaders is he has humanized this experience for us. Yes, we want the facts, but he also tells stories about like his mom and the Sunday dinners. And you know, Sunday dinners are a really important part of many cultures. Right. Certainly in my family it is. And he talked about missing those Italian meals that she would cook. He talked about his brother who had the COVID-19 and his sister-in-law and the challenges and stresses that put on their families. And by humanizing it, I think he brings you in and it makes it easier to listen to the facts when they're coming from someone who has made himself someone that you can trust. And so I've been very impressed with him. From another part of the spectrum though, Jessica, those folks who get up every single day and go into our hospitals, go into our grocery stores, go on the front lines in the police and the fire and the paramedics and the mass transit workers. The people who are those essential workers who go to work because the wheels of our industry depend upon them being there. Our society is woven together by the strength that they provide are amazing. And one of the highlights of this entire horrendous episode for me was last week when a group of healthcare workers who flew in from all over the country, left their families, put themselves in harm's way to come to the New York City hospitals and serve, were heading home. And as they left, the police lined the streets and clapped for them. And every night in New York at 7 o'clock, everybody goes outside and claps. And that is just our little way of saying thank you. And I think that so often we lose touch about just the humanity of the situation and that society depends upon us all doing things, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good. I went down today to donate blood and somebody asked me, well, why would you do that? And I said, because there was a sign up that said that New York has a deficit of blood available and it's a safe environment. And I wore my mask and everybody there was observing the social distancing protocols. I'm like, why wouldn't we all do what we can do, right? And I'm seeing people all across this country who are turning out. And so it is those ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things that really will get us through. And yes, we also need important elected leadership too, but let's never minimize the service provided by the folks whose names we'll never know.
The work and the dedication and bravery of the essential workers will never be forgotten, and it's truly incredible what they're doing. I kind of want to shift now to ask a few questions from the audience. One is from one of our co-directors, Grace Attanasio, who asks, how do you think the media shifted politics or political views or actions, not only in the social media sense, but also in the fictionalized shows like Veep and Madam Secretary?
Oh, two of my favorite shows. I love those shows. Well, so this is an interesting topic because it's not just about politics, but I do think that entertainment has the ability through pop culture to drive culture. I mean, I'll give you a show like a remake of it's on now, Will and Grace. So when Will and Grace was originally airing, I mean, they came into your living room and it was so human and it had a lot to do with the shaping of culture around the LGBTQ community. And when I look at shows that are satirical like Veep, it's funny and it's entertaining. And then you contrast that with like West Wing, which was one of my favorite shows. And so I used to always say when we were in the White House, like, we could just have the kind of collegiality and leadership and spirit that was in West Wing. That was kind of my true north. And I think Madam Secretary captures it as well. And we all wish we had a Secretary of State that was behaving like that. So there is this kind of symbiotic relationship, and it can be a teaching instrument. I mean, one of the creative folks who I think is masterful at this is Shonda Rhimes. And, you know, I've watched every show she's ever produced. I've never missed a single Grey's Anatomy. She tries very hard to get the science right, because she realizes that people are getting a lot of information about medicine in her show, right? So she wants to get it right. But she also weaves in messages, and it could be everything, again, from respect for the LGBTQ community to domestic violence to workplace behaviors. I mean, she gets it all in there. And so the creativity that comes from delivering a message without it feeling like medicine is where the art is. And I think that, I know when we were in the White House, we spent a lot of time just talking to showrunners about, like, how do you think about these issues, and how do you communicate, because they meet people where they are, and they do it under the auspices of entertainment, but they also can deliver a very powerful message. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the media and in the entertainment business to deliver a real powerful message.
Most definitely. Kind of out of curiosity on that note, and since we have a little bit more time being quarantined, of the recent films you've seen or TV shows you've watched or books you've read, what has been the art that has been most inspiring to you and made you look more to the future?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a while ago, criminal justice is something I care a great deal about. I'm on the board of the Innocence Project here in New York, and it's devoted to using DNA to try to find who's incarcerated, people who are incarcerated who are actually innocent, prove their innocence and have them released. And Netflix just made a movie following 8 people who were wrongfully convicted. And again, it's such a powerful story when you get the behind the scenes and you appreciate how important our criminal justice system is, and the impact it can have on not just the individual lives, but their children, their parents, their extended family, when they are incarcerated, particularly when they are wrongfully incarcerated. Now, I also think we need to reform our criminal justice system for those who are convicted of a crime they committed. And there are lots of ways we can make it fairer, starting with our policing, starting with making sure every young child has an opportunity to avoid the system, making sure our policing is fair, making sure the judges have the flexibility and are not bound by these mandatory minimum sentences, making sure that people who are incarcerated get the tools that they need to lead self-sufficient, law-abiding lives when they're released. And then when they're released, welcoming them back into society, having paid their debt, making sure they have jobs and places to live, etc. But I have met literally hundreds of people who have been wrongfully convicted. And oftentimes they simply didn't have adequate legal representation, or bystanders got the facts wrong. But now with DNA, we are able to have a really effective tool. So I encourage everybody who has Netflix, go on, look at the story that was produced about these 8 folks, and the Innocence Network and the Innocence Project is just doing invaluable work. So get educated about something that not everybody knows a lot about, and I think you'll find it well worth your while.
Yeah, I will definitely check it out. I mean, it's really one of the reasons why I love art is that it's about the storytelling.
It is all about the storytelling.
If I may, I have one last question from the audience, kind of to close us out. And it's from Karina, and she asks, she's one of our co-directors as well. She asks, what was your favorite moment from the administration?
Goodness.
Hefty one.
It's so hard. It's a hard one because there were so many. But so stipulate that there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and every single day when I would go to work, I couldn't believe that this shy kid from the south side of Chicago grew up to work for the President of the United States as a senior advisor, and have the privilege of staying all 8 years. But I will tell you a quick story because it kind of wraps up what I think about public service and politics. So as I think everybody knows, one of President Obama's top priorities was the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And it was hard, far harder than it should have been. I mean, I never understood what was so tough about trying to make sure everybody had affordable health insurance, that people with pre-existing conditions, and I have one, I don't hardly know anybody my age who doesn't have one, wouldn't have to worry about our insurance skyrocketing when we need it most. We shouldn't have to worry about lifetime or annual caps, again, on our insurance. Women should get preventive care. Young people can stay on their parents' plans until they're 26. All of that seems so obvious to me. And then the 20 million people who through the exchanges have been able to sign up and get health insurance, and those who get it through the states that have expanded their Medicaid. All of that just seemed obvious, but it wasn't. And there was a lot of political opposition to even considering it, even though we spent months trying to get Republicans to come on board because we thought it was important to try to make it bipartisan. And it was modeled after a law that was passed in Massachusetts when Republican Governor Romney was a governor. And so we thought, all right, why would the Republicans object to something that was adopted in a Republican state? So anyway, long wind up to say, the night that we knew we finally had the votes to get it passed, after months and months and months of work, I went home to go watch the vote on television. And I had on my pajamas and my bowl of popcorn, glass of wine, sitting there waiting for the vote. And the president's assistant reached out and she said, President would like everybody who worked on the Affordable Care Act to come back to the White House. And I thought, yeah, I'm in my BJs, I'm cool. And I said, well, I think I'll just stay here. And so she said, the president would like everybody who worked on this to come back. That means you. And one of my colleagues, Susan Schur, who is sitting on my couch. So the two of us go back to the White House. And it was a magical moment to be there. And he invited everybody from the junior most person on my staff who had found what we call the real people whose stories helped explain why this was so important to the Vice President Biden. And when it was over, he said, come on up to the Truman balcony and we're going to celebrate. Now, if you can imagine what that was like when suddenly, spontaneously, the president invites 100 people upstairs, and part of how he got away with it is the first lady was out of town. And so, but you could imagine his Secret Service name was Renegade, and you could imagine them going, Renegade plus 100 coming upstairs. So we all go running upstairs, and it was so exciting. Most of the staff had never been up there before, and it was an unseasonably warm night, and we go out on the Truman balcony. And he thanked everyone. I mean, went around to every single person and made them appreciate their role in this historic achievement. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the evening, and I'm talking like 2 a.m, we were out there quite late. I sidled up to him and I said, you look so happy tonight. I said, how you feel tonight compare to when you were elected back in November of 2008 in Chicago? And was also a wonderful, unseasonably warm celebration out in Grant Park. And he looked at me, and we're looking out over the south lawn of the White House, and you can see the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial in the distance. It's just a magical spot. It's my favorite spot in the White House. And he said, Valerie, there's no comparison between the two nights. He said, election night was just the means to get to this night. Right. The election was about politics. This is about service. And when you have that baton, your job is to just fight as mightily as you can in service of what's in the best interest of the American people. And it isn't always the most popular thing to do at the time. But now the reason why that law is the law today is because people who have benefited from it have kind of raised up and said, don't you dare take my ACA away, even though when it first passed, it wasn't as popular as it is today. And that's leadership, Jess. That's being able to look forward and seeing what would be seismic and appreciating that change is hard and it's painful and it's complicated and messy. And decades from now, I hope people will look back and view that as a seismic moment, just as when Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid all passed.
That's truly an incredible story, and really to see the impact of that act still today must be an amazing feeling.
It does feel good.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for taking the time to speak with us tonight. On behalf of Ivy Film Festival, we really appreciate you and sincerely appreciate that you took the time to speak with us.
I'm delighted to be with you all. I wish you all the best. We're counting on you all to be the change that we can all believe in. So vote, go out there and get your friends to vote, run for office yourself when you get out of school, make the difference. Take that baton and run with it. That's how our country grows and improves.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.